In last year's State of Play 2020 report, Project Play issued a call for leadership to make community-based youth sports more affordable. Ideas like leveraging the power of the permit to lower costs of facilities and background checks, or taking advantage of new sources of funding like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, could make a big difference in increasing access to youth sports for the most price-conscious families. One major milestone toward funding community-based play this year came out of New York, where the state's legalization of sports betting will include a carve-out that benefits sports-based youth development programs. 1% of tax revenues collected in the first year and $5 million per year after that. Now, as other states and communities debate the same question, how can you make the case for funding youth sports where you live? We're joined today by Assemblymember Monica Wallace of Lancaster, New York, who was a key champion in Albany for including youth sports funding in New York's budget. We're also joined by Benita Fitzgerald Mosley, an Olympic gold medalist who today serves as the youth sports industry as the president of the Fun Play initiative at technology company League Apps, where she is also the head of community and impact. She also serves as the executive director of the nonprofit Play Sports Coalition. And we're also joined by Julie Pearlman, a managing associate in public policy at Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, where her expertise covers government relations and advocacy in the world of sports. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to start with a question for you, Monica. As I talked to folks who were involved in getting youth sports funding included in the New York budget, they all said it was absolutely crucial to have you involved as a champion for the project. So how did you come to take the lead on this?
I guess my involvement really, if we roll back, and I'm sure Julie is very familiar with this, back in 2018, the Supreme Court had struck down a federal ban on sports betting. And so that kind of left states starting to think about a way to generate additional revenue, right? States are always looking for additional revenue. And we, as a legislature, considered it in 2019, but it never kind of happened. But then, of course, COVID hit. And I was very aware and recognized that the passing sports betting was very likely in New York State in 2020 just because of the financial circumstances that we're in. I was also very well aware of the research that the Aspen Institute and other organizations had done, showing the many, many benefits of sports betting, of youth sports, and how the disparity really creates so many challenges and inequities. And of course, 2020 was also the year of exposing all the inequities that exist in our society, right? And so it was sort of a confluence of all these things coming together where I kind of saw the writing on the wall and thought, this sports betting is going to pass. And if we're going to be passing it anyway, let's try to create a dedicated revenue stream that would allow us to do some good with this revenue and make sure that we're directing the revenue where it can do much good for future generations. And again, based a lot upon the research that the Aspen Institute and Project Play had already done.
We know that debates around sports betting and around youth sports can get pretty heated and can get pretty broad. So what are some key things for someone organizing a youth sports advocacy campaign to keep in mind when they're forming their talking points?
So when putting together talking points, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is the talking points should be concise and direct, and clearly identify the ask or the asks along with accompanying rationale for those asks. So Project Play has put together a tremendous amount of resources highlighting the benefits of youth sports as well as the lack of access for underserved communities. So it's just a matter of distilling that information down and turning it into something that's easily digestible and sort of punchy. Legislators hear from all different industries on a variety of different issues every single day. So it's important to create talking points that will allow you to effectively and efficiently communicate your position in a concise manner.
Thanks. And I know, Monica, you'd be the first to say you couldn't get this done alone. And Benita, that's really where the Play Sports Coalition came in here. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about how it came together last year and how it was able to plug in to support this effort in New York State.
We are all being adversely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the smallest nonprofit sports organizations are providing free access to sport to so many kids were shut down completely. They were the slowest to come back in many cases. And so, in bringing all of us together, working and really promoting the idea that sport needs to be preserved, and identifying opportunities like in New York to band together and support the effort to create legislation or carve out legislation to get additional funding for youth sports was really, really important. Just like, the Olympics just added together to the official motto. So it's swifter, higher, stronger, together. Our industry's best when we're all together, and the coalition really embodies that. And we're really proud to have been recognized as the Project Play champion in 2020 of the Play Sports Coalition. And we represent the biggest youth sports organizations, as well as small local sports-based youth development organizations. And we're just getting started. We're kind of reframing and relaunching the coalition in a more effective way with an 18-member all-star board of directors. So stay tuned for more information on the coalition.
Thanks, Benita. And I remember when this was going through the legislature in Albany, seeing a sign-on letter to the Speaker of the Assembly, or Monica, I apologize, I forget the leader of the State Assembly in New York. And it was signed by all of these sports-based youth development groups from New York State. And if I remember right, Play Sports and Fun Play had a key role in putting that together.
That was the real key. In speaking with Assemblywoman Wallace, she spoke a little bit earlier about the importance of having stakeholders in the community, voters in that state or that municipality, speak out, send letters, emails, make phone calls to legislators because that's what's really going to move the needle, and highlight and promote the idea so that they feel comfortable including it in the legislation. And so we were well positioned with almost 4,000 organizations nationally, many of whom are headquartered in New York State, quite a few in New York City, and quite a few again are these grassroots organizations that not only do we want to survive, but we want them to thrive and serve even more kids. And quite frankly, the up to maybe $5 million that is going to be going annually to these organizations is as much as all the grant funding across the country really that's going to youth sports organizations in total. So we're essentially doubling that in just one fell swoop through the state of New York, which is just incredible.
Assemblywoman Wallace, I mentioned off the top that in New York, 1% of tax revenues collected in the first year, and then $5 million after that will be dedicated to sports-based youth development programs. How did the deal ultimately come together? Was those the figures that you put in your first draft and it was smooth sailing all the way through?
I think if I remember correctly, I was seeking 5% overall of the revenue, but it was really hard to pin down exactly how much revenue would be coming from youth sports. There were projections, but it wasn't really clear whether those projections would be accurate. And then also what were the figures on the needs specifically in New York. So, and then, of course, there's always sort of a dance at the end about, what the final language, but I was very happy with the result of 1% for the first year and then 5 million thereafter, because you're creating a dedicated revenue stream where none exists. And it's always easier to add one than it is to, it's always easier to add money to an existing stream than it is to create a stream. And one of the things I didn't mention is I thought it was absolutely imperative that we get that funding stream going when it passed and not try to do it after, because once the bill passed and the revenue was allocated elsewhere, it would be much harder because now you're pulling back from a different need in the state. So so the fact that we got at least a dedicated revenue stream, and I know I've already spoken to a lot of the folks about how important it is to keep good data on, how this money is being spent and whether it's having the impact that we intend, which I'm sure it will, so that we can make the case again that even more money would make more of an impact.
And Benita, as I understand it, in New York, this new funding will be managed by the Office of Children and Family Services. How is the grant process being structured now that the funding is secured? Is Fun Play involved?
We are helping advise the Office of Children and Family Services in New York to help identify the criteria for those awards and the grant process and how those program costs that are going to be included in those the grant. We want first and foremost for those organizations to be nonprofit organizations. That's the first criteria. We want them to not only provide sports opportunities, but also positive youth development outcomes for those youth as well, where they're improving the lives of those young people through the physical activity and sport, but also through positive social emotional skills, development of educational skills and outcomes. We want there to be long-term, lifelong impacts to those children and their families as a result of their participation in these very holistic programs. And, I think that we want to focus on safety, right? Background checks and those kinds of things being required, coach education, ensuring that those coaches are well versed around the safety stuff, around the youth development outcomes, and we want to be tracking the data so that we understand and can further justify why this $5 million is being well spent, that it's sports programs and on the surface you may people who think, oh gosh, those that might go better to food banks or to education or to employment. But what we feel like is that the sport is a hook that really gets kids excited. It certainly has the both physical and mental health outcomes. But when you pair that with programs that are uniquely designed and holistically designed to create outcomes beyond the playing field, that's when the magic happens. And tracking that data and the impact data is going to further help us keep the 5 million, or hopefully at some point grow that amount of money that's going to these programs.
So, Julie, beyond the finding a local champion, aligning talking points, mobilizing network, the real advocacy work, should local communities be planning ahead for implementation by designing their own draft language and grant criteria?
Absolutely. Drafting bill language to hand, or at least offer to a legislator and or their staffer is always a good idea, particularly in states where the state has been considering mobile sports betting legislation for at least a couple of years now. Drafting legislation that fits into an existing draft bill is a good idea, and I think, of course, looking to New York as a model, being the first state to carve out youth sports funding is a good idea.
Any last words of advice for a youth sports leader in another state who's hoping to follow this same path?
Together we're better. That's what I'll say. And I know that people are working in their silos, but when you bring government officials like Assemblywoman Wallace who are passionate about this area, youth sports organizations that are serving youth and particularly those in underserved communities and creating additional access, and that's when the magic happens. And I think together you can achieve really great things in whatever state it is.
I would say it might also be a good idea if you're trying to when you're trying to identify that champion is giving them the opportunity to come see a youth sports development program, visit it in practice. I did that recently, and it was incredibly rewarding. I got a chance to see, a group of girls from the same community, which was a low-income, underserved community, where they would move from, basketball to field hockey to soccer, and then they were inside and they were talking about confidence and peer pressure, and they're developing these friendships in a neighborhood together where they didn't know each other before that. So hopefully now they'll recognize each other in school and develop this sort of, friendship and peer support that didn't exist before. So the benefits are just, tenfold. And I think having a legislator recognize that and see it in action is really critical.
I would just add that there's so much momentum right now in the state legislators to either pass mobile sports betting legislation or in some cases amend existing law that legalizes sports betting. So with all of this momentum, we do have the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of many youth and in local communities.
Well, thanks so much to all of you for joining me. I'm afraid we are out of time. You can find more resources on how to get your state to fund youth sports on our Project Play Summit website at as.pn/ppsummit21.